In this video, we're going to make a drag and drop system for our hotbar so that if players want to move around the inventory into different slots, they're able to do so. So the first thing that we're going to have to do is we're going to go into our inventory interface and we're going to create a new texture rect node. We're going to rename this and it's going to be called our dragged item. The purpose of this is going to be when we are dragging an item from slot to slot, it's going to mirror the texture or the image of whatever item we're moving. So we're not actually duplicating that item. We're just going to be dragging a visual representation of that item across our hotbar. We need to make a couple of adjustments to this where we need our mouse needs to be on the ignore on filter. And then we're going to do bit width proportional and keep aspect centered in our stretch mode. And that's all we have to do here right now. Actually, wait, no, we don't. We need the custom minimum size to be 24 and 24. And same thing in the transform. And we want this because we want to have it match the sizes of what is going to be in our original item. Now let's head into our inventory slot script. So we have to add a new signal to this script. And we're going to call this the slot clicked signal. And it's going to take in a few variables, or it's going to be passing in a few different variables for us. We're going to get the slot index, which is an integer, the button index, which is an integer, and then pressed, which is a bool. So the slot index is going to be which inventory slot was interacted with. And the button index is going to let us handle which mouse button caused the interaction. So right click to select. Sorry, right click is going to be able to use the item. Left click is going to be actually selecting the item. And then pressed is whether or not the button was pressed or released. We need to add two variables to this. One is going to be item data. It's going to be of type item data. We're going to default it to null. And we're going to need an item quantity, which can be defaulted to 0. Then we need to go and modify our existing display item method. So we're going to slightly change the variable name to what we're passing in to be the p item data. And then our item data is going to be assigned to that p item data. And our item quantity is going to be equal to the quantity. And that is all that we're going to need to do there. Then we need to go modify our clear method because we also need to make sure that we're resetting our item data to null and our item quantity to 0 whenever we're clearing out an item in that slot. Then we need to actually create a GUI input handler. So we're going to create a new method, which is we can tap into a built-in Godot method. And we're going to check if the event is an input event mouse button. And if it is, we're going to emit our slot clicked signal. We're going to pass in the slot index, the event button index, and then event.pressed. Then we need to go into our inventory manager and we need to make a new method to allow us to be able to swap items. So let's go to the bottom of our script. We'll create a new swap items method where the first variable is going to be from slot. And then the second one is going to be to slot. These are going to reference the slot indexes and we're not going to return anything. So the first thing we're going to do is validate that the slots actually exist so we don't have any errors. So we're going to see if the inventory doesn't have the from slot or if it doesn't have the to slot. Then we're just going to return. So we're not going to continue if we don't have either of those slots. Then we're going to actually have to go and perform the swap for the items if we get through here. So we're going to create a temporary variable. It's going to be our inventory and get the to slot. So the index at the to slot. And then we tap into our inventory to slot. It's going to be equal to the inventory at the from slot index. Then in our inventory at the from slot index, we're going to set that equal to the temporary that we just created. Then we're just going to have to notify the UI. So we're going to do inventory updated .emit and pass in our inventory. So the nice thing about this is it's pretty simple. Our inventory is just a dictionary of slot indices and items. So we don't need to do any special handling for empty slots because null values are okay. And all the visual updates happen automatically through this inventory updated signal. So now that we have all of this done, we can go back to the inventory interface and start updating this script, which is where most of the changes are going to happen. So the first thing we're going to do is drag in the onReady variable for the dragged item. And then we need to add a couple of variables so we can add some tracking to this. We're going to have a variable called dragging slot index. It's going to be an integer, and we're going to default this to -1 like we have previously. We're going to have a Boolean variable called isDragging, which we're going to default to false. And then we're going to have a current hover slot, which is an integer and also default to -1. We need to also modify our ready method, where the only thing that we're going to do here is make sure that the dragged item's visibility is set to false. Then we have to add a process method. And inside of this process method, we're going to check if we're dragging. And if we are, we're going to get the dragged item's global position. And we're going to set it equal to get viewport. And then our get the mouse position. And then we're going to subtract the dragged item size and divide that by 2. So this is going to allow us to update the drag preview to follow our mouse position. Then we need to get our mouse position, or actually assign it to a variable. So we're going to get the viewport, and then get our mouse position. And then we are going to reset our current hover slot to -1 for slot in inventory slots. We're going to have an if statement for if the slots get global rect.hasPoint, and we pass in our mouse position. And if it does, the current hover slot is going to be equal to the slot.slotIndex. And then we break out of this for loop. So this for loop is just finding out which slot, if any, we're actually hovering over. So this is going to help us, smooth visual movement. And this is just for visual and UI work. There's no real physics needed, so that's why we're in the process method. Then we need to go in and add the built-in input method. So we're going to be using this input method and the unhandled input method. But this input method is going to handle our drag operations because we want to catch all mouse input, not just unhandled events. And this is going to be more reliable for us to catch those mouse releases. So what we're going to do here is we're going to check if the event is an input event mouse button, and if the event button index equals the mouse button left. Then we do another if statement of if the not event pressed and we're dragging. Another if statement of if our current hover slot doesn't equal -1 and our current hover slot does not equal the dragging slot index. Then we have a method called endDragging, which is something that we will create shortly. Else, we're going to have a method called cancelDrag, which we're also going to make shortly. So this is checking if our mouse is released while we're dragging, and then if we're actually hovering over a different slot, we can perform the swap. If there's the same slot or no slot, we're going to cancel the drag. So let's create these endDragging and cancelDragging methods. So we're going to do endDragging and endDragging, and it's going to take in a target slot index, which is an integer, and it's not going to return anything. Then we're going to create the cancelDrag method, which is not going to have any arguments, and it's also not going to pass in anything. So now that we need to work on this endDragging, we also realize we're not passing in the right thing here. So we need to pass in the current hover slot to endDragging in order for this to work properly. Inside the endDragging method, we're going to check if the dragging slot index doesn't equal our target slot index. We're going to tap into our inventory manager. We're going to swap the items. We're going to do the dragging slot index and then our target slot index. Then we can do just some setup of properties. So we're going to look at the dragged item. We're going to make it visible, set it as false. I'm going to look into our inventory slots at the index of dragging slot index. We're going to get the item texture. We're going to modulate the alpha and put it to 1.0. Then we're going to set is dragging back to false. In cancel drag, all we're going to do is we can copy this bit. And we need to, looks like I forgot something up here too. We also need to set the dragging slot index in both of these back to -1. So this line, dragging, not dragging, dragging slot index can also be brought up here. Then we need to create a method called onSlotClicked, which is going to take in a slot index, which is an integer, a button index, which is an integer, pressed, which is a bool. We're going to check if our button index is equal to the mouse button left, and we're pressed. Then we do another check to see if we're not dragging. In our inventory slots, at the slot index, get the item data and make sure it doesn't equal null. Then we can start dragging. So start dragging is another method that we're going to be building in a second. And we pass in the slot index to that method. Otherwise, we're going to check if the button index is equal to mouse button right and pressed, and we're not dragging. Then we are going to flash and use the slot at that slot index. So this is going to allow us to actually use items and drag and drop. So then we need to make the start dragging method, which takes in a slot index, which is an integer. This doesn't return anything. We're going to get the dragging slot index, set it equal to the slot index. We're going to make is dragging be true. We're going to get the dragged items texture and set it equal to the item that we're going to actually be dragging. So we get it from the inventory slots at the slot index, get the item data, and then grab its texture. Then we want to set the dragged items visible to true. And then we're going to do one final bit here, where we're going to get the inventory slots at the slot index, get the item texture, and we're going to modulate the alpha to be 0.5. So what this is going to do is when we're dragging it, it's going to not be as clear. It's going to have a slight opacity to it. Now we should be able to go test this out. Oop, I need to go to our test scene. Let me open this. All right. Okay. Something's not working. I can't drag and drop. So let's go take a look here. Doesn't seem like our slot clicks are being registered. Okay. Yeah, so what I didn't do was I didn't actually connect to the signal. So when we connect, I need to actually pass in my onSlotClicked method. Now when we run it, everything should be working. Let's see. Yeah, there we go. And then if I right click, I can use the items, but otherwise, and if I drag and drop up here, it goes back. But if you're in the slot, it allows you to transfer. Okay, and I think that about wraps up this tutorial. Stay tuned for the next one.